The first reports of the Tiger tank reached Soviet lines like tales of an unstoppable monster. Soldiers whispered that it was invincible, a steel beast that could shrug off shells, tear through entire battalions, and vanish into smoke without a scratch. In the autumn of 1942, during the brutal fighting around Leningrad, those rumors turned into grim reality. Through the fog and snow, Soviet crews first saw it, a colossal silhouette with a long, heavy barrel and armor that looked impenetrable. The Tiger I had arrived. At first, panic followed wherever it appeared. T-34 and KV-1 crews soon learned that their guns, once so effective, could barely scratch the new German tank's armor. Shells bounced off its thick steel plates like pebbles against stone. Soviet infantry watched helplessly as their own tanks burned, one after another. The Tiger's 88 millimeter gun tore through targets at ranges they could scarcely imagine. It was not just a tank. It was a symbol of German superiority, a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. But behind the fear, Soviet intelligence was already working. Captured fragments, reports, and wrecks told another story, one less mythical and far more human. The Tiger was powerful, yes, but it was also slow, heavy, and mechanically fragile. Its armor was unmatched, but its engine strained under its own weight. Each Tiger demanded immense maintenance, gallons of fuel, and constant repairs. Every kilometer it traveled risked breakdown. What the Germans had built as a masterpiece of engineering came at the price of reliability. Still, to the Soviet soldiers facing it, that knowledge was little comfort. Throughout late 1942 and into early 1943, the Tiger stalked the battlefields like a predator. In the open steppes near Kharkov, platoons of T-34s were torn apart before getting within firing range. Anti-tank gunners cursed as their shells ricocheted harmlessly. Even aircraft struggled to destroy it, as its thick armor shrugged off shrapnel and small-caliber bombs. The German high command believed the Tiger would change the course of the war. In their minds, it was an indestructible weapon, the tank that would crush the Red Army's endless tide of steel. Its crews were handpicked, its movements recorded and analyzed. They saw it as a symbol of order, discipline, and superiority, everything the Wehrmacht prided itself on. Yet in the ruins of captured villages, Soviet scouts began to notice something strange. Tigers often broke down after only a few kilometers of travel. Mechanics labored endlessly to replace gearboxes and repair the suspension. When the mud thickened or the frost deepened, their engines groaned and failed. What was meant to be unstoppable often became immobile, and when a Tiger stopped moving, it became something else entirely. A target. By the spring of 1943, the Red Army had learned to hunt them. Soviet engineers developed new ammunition, refined tactics, and learned the Tiger's weaknesses. Infantry began carrying armor-piercing charges. Artillerymen aimed for the thinner armor on the sides and rear. Tank crews coordinated to outflank the massive machines, striking where they were most vulnerable. The Soviets were no longer in awe. They were learning. Then came Kursk, the turning point. The largest tank battle in history would test every myth surrounding the Tiger. Hundreds of German tanks, including the feared Tigers, advanced across fields that seemed endless. The Soviet defense was deep, layered, and merciless. Minefields, trenches, and artillery waited for the German steel columns. The first Tigers rolled forward, confident as ever, their guns thundering. But this time, they weren't facing an unprepared enemy. The Soviets had studied them, trained for them, and built weapons specifically to destroy them. What began as a test of strength became a demonstration of adaptation, and a revelation that even the most terrifying weapon could bleed. At Kursk, the battlefield was alive with fire, smoke, and thunder. The German assault began at dawn, their armored spearheads driving into the Soviet lines with ruthless precision. Tigers led the charge, their 88 millimeter guns tearing through dug-in positions, their engines growling like beasts unleashed. They advanced with confidence. After all, nothing the Soviets had fielded before had ever truly stopped them. But this time, the Soviets had been waiting. Months of preparation had turned the steppes into a fortress of steel and earth. Layer upon layer of defenses stretched for miles, trenches, anti-tank ditches, and minefields designed specifically to halt even the mighty Tiger. Every Soviet gun position, Every artillery piece had its range calculated and its targets predetermined. As the first Tigers pushed forward, they entered zones of concentrated fire. Mines detonated beneath their treads, tearing away the heavy links and leaving the massive machines stranded. Artillery shells rained down from concealed batteries, aiming not at their thick frontal armor, but at their sides and rear. Smoke filled the air as anti-tank crews, often working until their last breath, fired volley after volley. The battlefield trembled beneath the clash of engines and explosions. For the first time, the Tiger's reputation met the reality of total war. Its armor still shrugged off most shells, but its vulnerabilities were now being exploited. Soviet tankers and T-34s moved in coordinated packs, circling, maneuvering, striking from multiple directions. Their speed became their weapon. While one drew the Tiger's fire, others flanked and fired at close range. What once seemed impossible began to happen. Tigers burned. Reports from the front startled even German officers. Dozens of their prized machines lay smoldering in the fields of Kursk. Some were destroyed by direct hits, others by mechanical failure, trapped and abandoned in craters of churned earth. The Soviets had discovered that the Tiger's armor, while thick, was not invincible. A lucky shot to the turret ring, engine deck, or undercarriage could disable it permanently. But the most damning discovery was mechanical. As the battle dragged on, the Tigers suffered from overheating and fuel shortages. Their heavy engines guzzled gasoline at a rate the Wehrmacht could not sustain. Supply lines broke under Soviet air attacks. Stranded tanks were blown up by their own crews to prevent capture. What had been built as an unstoppable spearhead now found itself bleeding from 1,000 unseen cuts. On the Soviet side, something remarkable was happening. Confidence. Crews who once trembled at the mention of the Tiger now faced it with grim determination. They learned to spot its silhouette, to identify its weak points, to coordinate their fire. Soviet anti-tank gunners were no longer hesitant. They waited calmly for the perfect shot, often letting the Tiger close before striking its vulnerable sides. The myth of invincibility was crumbling. The Tiger's impact remained deadly, but it was no longer enough to break the Soviet line. The Red Army, with its sheer numbers, resilience, and growing tactical sophistication, began to press forward. Each destroyed Tiger was a symbol, proof that even Germany's greatest creation could be beaten. By the time the Battle of Kursk ended, over 1,500 German tanks had been lost, including many of the vaunted Tigers. The Germans had failed to achieve their breakthrough. The Soviets had not only survived, they had learned, adapted, and turned fear into strategy. For the Tiger crews who survived, the truth was painful. Their tanks were powerful but fragile, their supply chains too thin, their enemy too determined. The Panther and Tiger divisions had been meant to crush the Red Army. Instead, they had been consumed by it. For Soviet tankers, the victory at Kursk was more than tactical. It was psychological. The Tiger was no longer a nightmare. It was just another machine, one that could be broken, one that could burn like any other. The battlefield had shifted, and with it, the course of the war. After Kursk, the legend of the Tiger began to fade, replaced by the harsh reality of a weapon that could no longer guarantee victory. What had once inspired dread now carried the scent of vulnerability. Across the Eastern Front, Soviet troops learned to recognize its silhouette not with fear, but with grim confidence. They had faced it, fought it, and learned that even the most fearsome machine could die under the right fire. As the Red Army advanced westward, more and more Tigers were left behind, burned out, bogged down, or abandoned. The once prized tanks that had symbolized German might now sat half-sunk in the mud, their massive hulls stripped of usable parts. Soviet engineers examined the wrecks with fascination. They noted the complexity of its construction, the weight of its armor, the sophistication of its optics. It was undeniably a masterpiece of engineering, and that was exactly its downfall. The Tiger was too perfect for war. Every component demanded precision, every movement required maintenance. Its tracks were prone to snapping under strain, its transmission could fail with the slightest error. Its fuel consumption was monstrous, more than triple that of a T-34. For the German war machine, Already choking under the pressure of Allied bombing and collapsing supply lines, the Tiger was a logistical nightmare. By contrast, the Soviets had embraced simplicity. The T-34 could be repaired in the field with a wrench and a hammer. Its engine started in the freezing cold. Its wide tracks cut through mud and snow with ease. For every Tiger that rolled off German assembly lines, the Soviets built 10 T-34s, fast, reliable, and relentless. It wasn't a contest of technology anymore. It was a contest of endurance. In 1944, as the Red Army pushed into Belarus and Ukraine, the balance had fully shifted. The Tiger still terrified infantry when it appeared, its long 88-millimeter gun capable of annihilating tanks from miles away. But such moments were rare. Increasingly, the Tigers arrived late, broke down early, or ran out of fuel before they could make a difference. Even when they did reach the front, Soviet crews were ready. The new T-34/85 had arrived, a machine designed specifically to meet the Tiger on equal terms. With its improved gun, thicker armor, and enhanced mobility, it gave Soviet tankers the weapon they needed. For the first time, they could fight the Tiger head-on and survive. The duels that followed were brutal and decisive. On open plains in villages and through forests, the Tigers were hunted systematically. The Red Army had turned experience into doctrine. Strike fast, flank hard, never give the Tiger time to aim. For German officers, the frustration was unbearable. They had poured their faith, their prestige, and their dwindling resources into the Tiger divisions. Now those divisions were being swallowed by the Soviet tide. The Tiger's armor, once its greatest strength, had become its prison. It was too heavy for bridges, too slow for retreat, too precious to risk, yet too flawed to save the front. Even so, the Tiger remained a terrifying sight when it did appear. Soviet soldiers still spoke of its roar, that deep mechanical growl that echoed across the battlefield before the first shot fired. But it was no longer the herald of doom. It was a challenge, a test. Crews whispered to each other before battle that whoever destroyed a Tiger proved himself not just skilled, but worthy, and they did. Across the front, stories spread of T-34s ambushing Tigers, of small Soviet units destroying the so-called indestructible machines with courage and cunning. Where once the Germans had laughed at the simplicity of Soviet tanks, they now cursed their persistence. By mid-1944, it was no longer the Tiger that defined the battlefield. It was the Red Army's ability to adapt, to strike, and to overwhelm. The balance of fear had shifted completely. The invincible machine had become mortal, and the soldiers who once feared it now saw it as just another obstacle on the long road to Berlin. By the summer of 1944, the Eastern Front was no longer a battleground of equals. The Red Army was advancing on all fronts, and the German divisions that once pushed deep into Soviet soil were now in retreat. The Tiger, once hailed as the invincible symbol of German engineering, had become a relic of a war that Germany could no longer sustain. It was still deadly in the hands of experienced crews, but its dominance had passed. The tide of war had turned, and the machine that had once embodied superiority now stood as proof that perfection was useless without endurance. Soviet tank crews no longer hesitated when reports of Tigers came in. They had learned through experience, not theory, how to destroy them. The methods were clear, almost routine. Approach from the flanks, hit the thinner armor, use the terrain, and never fight one alone. A single Tiger might destroy a few tanks, but soon the Red Army's numbers and coordination would overwhelm it. What once took courage now required discipline and skill. Qualities the Soviet Armored Corps had refined through years of blood and fire. In the fields of Belarus and Poland, these lessons were put to the test. Operation Bagration, the Soviet summer offensive of 1944, unleashed a storm the Germans could not withstand. Entire divisions were wiped out in weeks. Tigers that tried to defend key crossroads or river crossings found themselves surrounded and isolated. Their great guns roared, cutting down dozens of advancing Soviet vehicles, but the pressure never stopped. Once their ammunition ran low or their engines overheated, they became immobile targets. Soviet artillery, bombers, and infantry finished what the tankers had started. Captured Tigers littered the countryside. Soviet engineers studied them again, this time not with awe, but with clinical interest. They admired the craftsmanship, the precision gears, the complex optics, the thickness of the armor, but they also saw the flaws. Everything about the Tiger screamed excess. It was built for precision warfare, not survival in chaos. It needed constant care, a level of maintenance impossible in a war being lost. It was a masterpiece built by a nation collapsing under its own weight. Meanwhile, the T-34 continued to evolve. It could be built in days, repaired in hours, and operated by men who had learned to think like machines, efficient, determined, and unstoppable. Soviet production had reached a scale the Germans could never dream of. Where Germany produced hundreds, the Soviet Union produced thousands. The Tiger may have been stronger in a duel, but war was no longer about duels. It was about who could endure longer. And the Soviets had turned endurance into an art form. For the soldiers on the ground, the myth of the Tiger was dead. Reports came in of entire German tank companies forced to abandon their vehicles due to lack of fuel. Others simply broke down en route to the front. Soviet airstrikes targeted the long supply lines, leaving many Tigers stranded before ever firing a shot. Those that reached the front were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The Tiger's gun might still pierce a T-34 at a distance, but the Soviets no longer gave it that luxury. They attacked from the sides, through fog, in darkness, from every angle. As the Red Army advanced toward East Prussia, Soviet tankers began to see the Tiger not as a threat, but as a trophy. To knock one out was proof of mastery, not luck, but skill. Crews painted marks on their turrets, symbols of victory earned through fire and precision. In their eyes, the Tiger had lost its mystique. It was still deadly, still dangerous, but it was no longer untouchable. For German officers, the reality was inescapable. The Tiger's design, once a source of national pride, was now a burden. It consumed too much fuel, too many man-hours, and too many lives to justify its presence. In the chaos of retreat, they began to destroy them deliberately. Magnificent machines set aflame to prevent capture. Each burning tank marked another step in Germany's slow, inevitable collapse. By the autumn of 1944, as Soviet tanks rolled across the Vistula and into Poland, the Tiger's roar had grown faint. It was still respected, still feared in isolation, but its legend had been broken. The Red Army had not only defeated the machine, it had conquered the myth. By late 1944, the Eastern Front had become a storm of steel and exhaustion. The German army, once so confident in its mechanical superiority, was now struggling simply to survive. The Tiger tanks that remained were scattered, broken, or hiding in forests, waiting for repairs that would never come. What had begun as a symbol of unstoppable power was ending as a relic of over-engineering, a weapon designed for a war Germany could no longer afford to fight. The few Tigers still operating faced an enemy transformed. The Red Army's armored forces moved like a living organism, vast, coordinated, and merciless. Columns of T-34/85s advanced alongside IS-2 heavy tanks, mobile artillery, and aircraft that blotted out the winter sky. Against that, the Tiger's once superior gun and armor seemed almost meaningless. It could destroy tanks at long range, yes, but it couldn't be everywhere at once. And when the Soviets closed the distance, it was finished. The difference now was not just numbers, it was philosophy. The Tiger was a masterpiece that demanded perfection from its crew and its environment. The T-34 was built for imperfection, for mud, ice, and chaos. Soviet tankers embraced hardship as part of their craft. They knew their machines would break, but they also knew they could fix them, improvise, and fight again. German tankers, by contrast, had become mechanics first and warriors second, men fighting both the enemy and their own machines. In East Prussia, the battles turned desperate. German commanders tried to hold every bridge, every road, every village. Tigers were placed in defensive ambushes, waiting in forests or ruins, their guns aimed at narrow lanes where Soviet armor would appear. When they fired, they could still devastate. Entire platoons of T-34s could vanish under the crack of an 88mm shell. For brief moments, it seemed the old legend had returned. But then came the artillery, the airstrikes, the encirclement. No matter how many Soviet tanks burned, more always came. The Tiger's flaws were mercilessly exposed in retreat. Its transmission failed when forced to reverse quickly. Its engine overheated under strain. When bridges collapsed beneath its weight, entire crews were lost to rivers or marshes. Recovery vehicles couldn't tow them. They were simply too heavy. Once immobilized, a Tiger was doomed. Fuel shortages only worsened the situation. Commanders were forced to abandon working tanks simply because they couldn't keep them supplied. The Soviets knew this, and they exploited it. Their intelligence networks tracked where German armor concentrations were weakest. They didn't always need to destroy the Tigers. Sometimes surrounding them was enough. The Red Army had learned patience. Where once they charged recklessly, now they maneuvered strategically, isolating the German heavy tanks until their crews were forced to destroy them themselves. Each destroyed Tiger became a symbol of the changing war. Soviet photographers captured their burned shells, half buried in snow or mud, to show the people back home that the invincible enemy could bleed. Newspapers ran stories of tank crews who had taken down the Iron Beasts, turning victory into propaganda that inspired millions. What the Germans had once used to intimidate now served to strengthen Soviet resolve. Inside Germany, engineers still tried to improve the Tiger's design, refining engines, simplifying components, but it was far too late. The factories were in ruins, fuel was scarce, and experienced workers were gone. The Tiger, born in an age of ambition, now limped through a world collapsing around it. And yet, despite everything, those who fought inside them remained defiant. Many crews refused to surrender their tanks, choosing instead to fight until their last shell. They knew the war was lost, but not their pride. For them, the Tiger remained a symbol, not of invincibility anymore, but of resistance in the face of inevitability. By the end of 1944, the Red Army was crossing into German soil. The once mighty Wehrmacht was in retreat, its tanks burning behind it, its soldiers exhausted and broken. The Tiger's roar still echoed occasionally across the forests and plains, but it no longer struck fear, only the sound of desperation in a war that had already been decided. The machine that had once been the terror of the Eastern Front was now only delaying the inevitable. The hunters had become the hunted, and the Tiger's time was running out. By January 1945, winter had once again seized the Eastern Front, wrapping the landscape in ice and silence. The Tiger tanks that once dominated the fields of Russia were now fighting and dying in the frozen ruins of Germany itself. Their steel hulls, caked in frost and soot, stood as monuments to a fading empire. The Red Army was advancing faster than ever, its armored divisions pushing relentlessly through East Prussia, Silesia, and into the heart of the Reich. The invincible Tiger, once the terror of the steppe, was being cornered in its own homeland. The remaining Tiger battalions fought with grim determination. They were no longer part of grand offensives or sweeping maneuvers. They were holding actions, desperate, isolated defenses designed to buy time. In the ruins of villages and forests, the Tigers took up hidden positions, their long 88mm guns waiting for the first Soviet silhouettes to emerge from the mist. When they fired, the results were devastating. A single Tiger could still destroy multiple Soviet tanks before being spotted. But the Red Army had learned too well how to respond. Artillery and rocket barrages followed every engagement. The moment a Tiger revealed its position, the earth around it exploded in fire. The German officers commanding them knew the truth. Their mighty tanks were now sacrifices. They could no longer maneuver freely, nor rely on fuel or reinforcements. Each day brought new mechanical failures and fewer resources. Mechanics scavenged what parts they could from burned-out wrecks, cannibalizing one Tiger to keep another running for just one more day. Every battle was a race against time, not to win, but to survive long enough to fall back before encirclement. For the Soviet soldiers pressing forward, the Tiger was still dangerous, but it was no longer mysterious. They no longer froze when they saw its shape on the horizon. Instead, they worked as a machine themselves. Tankers advancing in formation, gunners coordinating with aircraft, infantry signaling artillery. They had turned the art of killing Tigers into a science. Anti-tank guns waited for the perfect moment. Katyusha rockets blanketed suspected ambush zones. When the smoke cleared, the Tigers were either burning or retreating once more. The contrast between the two armies was stark. The Red Army was fueled by momentum and endless supply lines stretching back across liberated territory. The Germans were running on fumes, quite literally. Fuel convoys rarely reached the front. Many Tigers were left behind, their tanks dry, their engines silent, destroyed by their own crews before capture. In the snow, the burned husks stood like monuments to futility. Even the Tiger crews, once proud and confident, had grown bitter. They had seen too much. They knew that their machines, though formidable, could not change the outcome. Some wrote in diaries that their tanks had become iron coffins, magnificent but doomed. The great weapon that had once been a symbol of power now trapped them in battles they could not win. Meanwhile, the Soviets pushed harder, learning with each engagement. The T-34/85 and ICE-2 tanks roared across the frozen plains, faster and more adaptable than their German counterparts. When the Tiger struck, the Soviets absorbed the blows and kept advancing. For every tank they lost, two more replaced it. It was a war of endurance, and the Red Army had more of everything: more fuel, more men, more machines, and now more experience. By February, the Tigers' legacy was ending, not with a single great battle, but with 1,000 small defeats. The machine that had once embodied German might now represent its exhaustion. In the villages and forests of East Germany, abandoned Tigers lay buried in snow, their engines seized, their guns pointed toward a horizon that no longer mattered. The Red Army didn't celebrate their destruction anymore. They simply passed them by. Another obstacle, another wreck on the long road to Berlin. For the engineers and officers who had once believed the Tiger would define a new era of warfare, the reality was undeniable. It had been built for domination, but it had become a monument to excess, too complex, too heavy, too fragile for the brutal simplicity of modern war. And as winter began to fade, so too did the last echoes of the Tiger's roar. By March 1945, the Tiger's story was nearly over. The Reich it had been built to defend was collapsing on all sides, its cities burning, its armies retreating or destroyed. The last Tiger battalions, once symbols of elite German engineering, now existed as fragments. A few tanks scattered across shattered landscapes, fighting hopeless battles against an enemy that refused to stop. The roads across Germany were littered with the remains of these machines. Some had been destroyed in combat, others had simply stopped moving, their engines seized or starved of fuel. The crews, exhausted and hollow-eyed, did what they could, patching holes, scavenging parts, sometimes pushing their tanks by hand just to reposition them. Many had long since accepted that their machines would outlive the war only as wrecks. Still, they fought on, driven by duty, pride, or the simple instinct to survive one more day. For the Red Army, advancing through this ruin, the Tiger had lost all mystique. Soviet soldiers now approached them with the cold precision of experience. They knew its weak points: the thinner side armor, the fragile rear, the vulnerable engine deck. The T-34/85s and IS-2s were faster, more reliable, and backed by endless waves of reinforcements. When a Tiger appeared, it no longer stopped the advance. It merely slowed it. The final confrontations were brutal but brief. In the forest near Kustrin, along the Oder River, and across the flatlands of Pomerania, Tigers dug into defensive positions, firing until they ran out of ammunition or overheated. Their shells still tore through Soviet armor with deadly accuracy, but each shot brought them closer to their end. Soviet artillery would soon follow, blanketing their positions in fire and smoke. Those few tanks that survived the bombardment were finished off by airstrikes or encirclement. One by one, the last Tigers were silenced, not in glorious battles, but in exhaustion. Mechanics who had once worshipped their engines now cursed them. The Maybach engines, under constant strain, broke down faster than ever. Oil froze overnight. Cooling systems cracked. Even minor faults became fatal. Spare parts no longer existed, and without them, every Tiger was living on borrowed time. The irony was cruel. The Tiger had been born out of ambition, a machine designed to dominate, to embody precision and power. But by the end, that same ambition had destroyed it. Its complexity, once a marvel, had become its weakness. It was too heavy to move through mud, too fuel-hungry to operate, too delicate to repair in a war that demanded simplicity. In the race between brilliance and practicality, the Tiger had lost. Meanwhile, the Red Army pressed ever closer to Berlin. For the Soviet tankers, the war had become a relentless rhythm of advance, attack, and pursuit. They no longer viewed the Tiger as their great adversary. It was simply another piece of the crumbling German war machine. Each time they passed a destroyed one, turret blown open, treads buried in mud, it reminded them of how far they had come since those fearful days of 1942. To the Germans, however, each wreck was a wound to national pride. The officers who had once boasted that the Tiger would turn the tide now faced the opposite truth. Their great weapon had failed to stop the Red Army. No matter how many Soviet tanks it destroyed, the numbers kept coming. An endless tide of steel and fire that no machine, no matter how advanced, could withstand. By April, as Berlin itself fell under siege, the Tiger had all but vanished from the front lines. A few stragglers fought in the suburbs, their guns echoing down shattered streets, but they were ghosts, fragments of a dying empire clinging to a myth. Their shots still carried power, but their meaning was gone. The war they had been built to win was already lost. And so, as the Red Army advanced on the German capital, the legend of the Tiger faded into history. Not with a final triumph, but with the quiet hiss of steam escaping from an overheated engine and the silence that followed. The machine that had once terrified the world now stood still, its armor cold, its gun aimed at nothing. When the first Soviet troops entered the outskirts of Berlin in April 1945, the war had already written its verdict. Among the ruins, in half-collapsed garages and burned-out depots, the remnants of Germany's armored divisions lay scattered. And there, buried beneath layers of soot and rubble, stood the last of the Tigers, immense, silent, and broken. The Tiger's final battles were waged not in the open fields where it had once ruled, but in the narrow, crumbling streets of cities. These tanks were never meant for such terrain. Their wide tracks struggled over rubble, their engines strained with every turn, and their long 88mm guns were too large for close-quarters fighting. Yet even in this environment, they fought with desperate intensity. A single well-positioned Tiger could hold off Soviet infantry for hours, its cannons shredding brick walls and crushing vehicles in its path. But it was always temporary. The Soviets adapted with ruthless efficiency. Flamethrowers, demolition charges, artillery strikes from every angle. There was no escape. For the crews inside, the once glorious machine had become a steel trap. The interior, meant to be a fortress, now felt like a coffin. The air was thick with oil fumes and the stench of fear. Ammunition was low, engines overheated quickly, and every hit from Soviet shells shook the entire hull. Many crews abandoned their Tigers before they could even be destroyed in combat, blowing up their own tanks to keep them from capture. Those who stayed fought until the last shell was fired. Meanwhile, Soviet engineers studied every wreck they encountered. They were fascinated and sometimes astonished by the craftsmanship and detail inside each Tiger. Precision gears, advanced optics, layered armor. These were hallmarks of German engineering at its peak. But they also saw the flaw that had doomed it all: over-engineering. The Tiger demanded maintenance that was impossible in real war. Its components, though exquisite, required conditions and resources that Germany could no longer provide. As the Red Army stormed deeper into Berlin, the contrast between the two machines, the Soviet T-34 and the German Tiger, could not have been clearer. One was built for war, simple, fast, easy to repair. The other was built for perfection, complex, heavy, demanding. And in total war, perfection was a luxury no nation could afford. When Soviet soldiers finally reached the Reich Chancellery, they passed by burned-out Tigers left behind by retreating crews. Their turrets were open, their ammunition scattered, and their hulls still warm from battle. Some had been destroyed by direct hits, others by their own hands. The Soviets rarely paused to admire them now. They were relics of a lost cause. German officers, captured or surrendering, spoke quietly of the tanks that had once symbolized invincibility. Some still admired their engineering, others cursed their impracticality. But all agreed that, in the end, it hadn't mattered. No machine could save Germany from a war it had already lost long before. In the weeks that followed the fall of Berlin, Soviet technical teams began gathering the remnants of these Tigers for study. They loaded the charred wrecks onto rail cars, shipping them eastward for examination. The engineers who examined them later would write reports praising their precision, yet none recommended copying their design. The Tiger was brilliant, but it belonged to a different kind of war, one that no longer existed. As the smoke cleared over Berlin, the world had changed forever. The age of the Tiger was over, and the lesson it left behind was written not in triumph, but in ruin. It had been a masterpiece of engineering, but a failure of philosophy, proof that even the strongest weapon cannot overcome the weight of arrogance and overconfidence. And as the city of Berlin lay in ashes, so too did the myth of German invincibility. The Tiger had roared for the last time. After the guns fell silent in Europe, the Allied powers began the immense task of dissecting what had just unfolded. Among the spoils of war, nothing fascinated engineers and military analysts more than the German Tiger tanks. The British, Americans, and Soviets all recovered examples, some barely damaged, others burned out hulks, and began a meticulous process of examination. What they found both impressed and bewildered them. The Tiger was, in many ways, a paradox. On one hand, it represented the pinnacle of wartime engineering, its armor nearly impenetrable to most Allied guns, its 88mm cannon capable of annihilating an enemy tank at distances that others could barely reach. The craftsmanship inside was extraordinary. Precision machine components, interlocking armor plates, advanced optics, and a suspension system decades ahead of its time. But this excellence came at a cost so steep it bordered on self-destruction. Allied engineers marveled at the complexity. They noted that building a single Tiger required more than 300,000 man-hours, nearly twice that of a Sherman or T-34. It consumed enormous amounts of steel, copper, and rubber, resources that Germany could not afford by 1944. And in the field, the tank's maintenance demands were staggering. Even something as simple as changing a track could take hours and require a crane. It was a machine designed for perfection, but war had no patience for perfection. Reports from the captured German workshops confirmed this. Mechanics struggled to keep the tanks operational, even under ideal conditions. The Maybach engines overheated frequently, especially in the east. The transmission, though finely built, cracked under the Tiger's immense weight. Many tanks broke down long before they ever reached the battlefield. Some were abandoned by their crews not because of enemy fire, but because they could not move. In contrast, the Allied tanks that had once seemed crude now appeared genius in their simplicity. The T-34 in particular earned grudging respect from engineers across the world. It could be built quickly, repaired in the field, and operated by soldiers with minimal training. Its diesel engine, unlike the Tiger's gasoline one, rarely caught fire and could start even in the brutal cold of the Russian steppe, something no German crew could ever claim. The American Shermans, too, demonstrated the power of industrial mass production. They were not as well-armored or as deadly as the Tiger, but they were everywhere. For every Tiger destroyed, 10 Shermans or T-34s rolled forward. The Allies had learned what Germany had not. Wars are won not just by technology, but by logistics, efficiency, and adaptability. When the German engineers themselves were shown the Allied production statistics after the war, they were stunned. Many had believed the Reich was keeping pace, that their superior machines balanced the enemy's numbers, but the reality was crushing. By the time Germany built one Tiger, the Soviets had already built more than 50 T-34s. The Americans were producing Shermans faster than the Germans could even repair their losses. It was this realization that shocked the surviving officers and engineers the most. Their obsession with technical superiority had blinded them to the larger truth, that the Tiger was never a sustainable weapon. It was a marvel of design, but also a monument to inefficiency. The Allies, having examined every bolt and bearing, reached the same conclusion. The Tiger had taught them a vital lesson about the limits of engineering in war. Power meant nothing if it couldn't be maintained. Strength meant little if it came at the cost of speed, numbers, and reliability. And so, the Tiger's legacy was sealed not as an unbeatable machine, but as a cautionary tale, a symbol of brilliance undone by arrogance. In the years that followed the war, the Tiger's legend only grew. On film reels and in soldiers' memories, it became a monster, an unstoppable beast of iron and thunder. To those who had faced it, the experience was unforgettable. The deep, echoing growl of its Maybach engine, the shriek of its 88 millimeter gun, the way it seemed to appear out of smoke like some mechanical predator. But historians and engineers who looked closer saw something different. The Tiger wasn't a monster, it was a myth built on fear, precision, and failure intertwined. Captured tigers were displayed in museums across Europe and the Soviet Union. Visitors marveled at their massive armor plates and towering guns. Yet the guides and curators often told the same story. This tank, though magnificent, was doomed by its own design. The complexity that once defined German engineering had turned against it. Every part that required perfection made it harder to produce, repair, and operate. The Tiger had fought brilliantly, but briefly. For German engineers who had survived the war, that truth was difficult to accept. Many of them, when interviewed in the 1950s, spoke with pride about the tank's capabilities. They called it a masterpiece built in the wrong war. But others were candid. They admitted that by chasing perfection, they had built a weapon unsuited for the battlefield they were actually fighting. What mattered in total war wasn't the perfect machine, it was the one that could be built quickly, repaired easily, and endure the chaos of combat. The Allies learned that lesson better than anyone. The post-war tanks of both East and West, the Soviet T-54, the British Centurion, the American M48, all bore traces of that understanding. They combined firepower, protection, and reliability in a way the Tiger never could. Engineers studied its flaws and vowed never to repeat them. The Tiger, once the pinnacle of armored warfare, had become a stepping stone, a warning about the cost of overcomplication. Still, for those who stood beside it, there was no denying its aura. The sheer size, the craftsmanship, the feeling of power that radiated from its steel form, it was hard not to feel awe. Even Allied soldiers who destroyed them often posed proudly beside the wrecks, knowing they had faced one of the most formidable tanks ever built. The Tiger's myth endured not because it was unbeatable, but because it represented the ambition and tragedy of a nation that believed its machines could defy reality. In the quiet years after the war, one Tiger in particular became famous. Tiger 131, captured intact in Tunisia in 1943. It was preserved, studied, and eventually restored to working order by the British. When it roared back to life decades later, the ground still shook, just as it had in 1943. The sound was haunting, a reminder of how close brilliance can come to madness. That single tank, now resting in the Bovington Tank Museum, stands as a living relic of the paradox that defined German engineering in the Second World War. It is magnificent to behold, but when you see it up close, you also see its flaws. The cracks in the armor, the cramped interior, the fragile transmission. It is beauty built on failure. The Tiger's story, then, is not one of glory, but of lessons learned the hard way. It was proof that technology, no matter how advanced, cannot overcome the limits of strategy, supply, and human endurance. It showed that the true power of a machine lies not in perfection, but in purpose. When the last Tigers burned out on the Eastern Front, they took with them the dream of invincibility that had once fueled the German war machine. What remained was the truth, that even the greatest engine of war can break under the weight of its own ambition. And so the legend of the Tiger ended not with a roar, but with a whisper, the whisper of cooling metal under a gray sky, fading into silence as history moved on. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.